So it's going to add to the ABV. So you want a sweet apple to add bulk to your cider. It's going to help actually drive the alcohol level higher. If you're looking for a higher alcohol level, you're probably using a higher proportion of sweet apples. So that's what the apple will contribute. We don't have a lot of sharp or acidic apples, but what the sharp or acidity is adding, as far as what you sense, is a sense of body to the taste. It's making the taste a little interesting. If you only use dessert apples, you can make cider with any of the apples, either a single apple or 1,000 apples in your juice. If you don't have any acidity in your juice, then it's going to taste flat, right? There isn't really anything to bring out those flavors. And a term back from the UK that you use for a cider, which is largely dessert based, is that it's thin, right? You get that initial taste at the beginning of the sip of the cider, but there's no sort of tail on the taste. There's no sort of interesting aromatics on the taste. It's a thin cider. It's refreshing, something you'd want to drink maybe over ice on a hot sunny day, but you know, when you're sitting in front of a fire for a long Maine winter, may be quite not so interesting. So sweetness equals sugar equals ABV for your ciders. Folks that didn't hear it at the back, is what's the perfect proportion of apples? So a bit of sweets, a bit of sharps, and there are a lot of other qualities in Cameron's model that he'll talk to in terms of flavor compounds in the juice. There isn't a perfect proportion. It depends on what you want to drink, and in some sense, you know, the apples that grow in your garden, or the apples on the side of the street, or the apples in the neighbour's garden that you've been keeping an eye on. Oh, you've got lots of good friends, right? Particularly if you're making cider, you have no end of friends. So there are different styles of cider. So I'll talk to just a couple, and we'll introduce others as we go. So we've tasted a dessert apple. So probably the cider tradition with the most dessert apples, and usually it's somewhere between 45 to 80%. It's something called the Eastern County style in England. It's mostly dessert fruit. It's that refreshing drink, high in alcohol, not really too complex. So we tasted also some acid as well. Probably the cider making tradition best known for its acid is in Asturias in northern Spain. So it's commonly thought to be the longest continuing sort of cider tradition in the world. And they use up to 40% of their juices from acidic apples. You've seen the long pour into the glass. That's to get the oxygen into the liquid, to take off some of that searing acidity. You do not want to drink a pint of Cider from Asturias unless you're trying to test, do I have acid reflux or not? If you want to test that, then a pint of cider is great. It's lovely with food, but that's another tradition. So there are traditions. So we'll talk specifically to bittersweet and bitter sharp a little later after you taste those apples, and what the proportions could be depending on the style you're interested in and what's available to you locally. In tasting rather than astringency. So what are those two things, and where do they come? Where do they come from? So the number of acids in apples. The vast majority of the acid, the sort of tartness that you would taste, is from malic acid. So 90% of the acid profile of an acid is from malic acid. There are some acids in very, very small quantities that can impact the taste, and they're typically grouped under the term of tannins. Right, so you know, a tannin is something that you'll be familiar with when you're tasting tea, for example. Tea has a lot of tannin in it. That sort of drying sensation, that astringency that Cameron talked to, is in tea. It's also in some kinds of wine. So if you think of the difference between a white wine that you may drink and a red wine. White wine doesn't have a lot of tannins in it. Red wine, you know, that sort of drying, again, the drying sensation or the bitter sensation, it's in red wine in a great deal. And as a brewer, as a cider maker, you can also add tannins. Sometimes they're called sacrificial tannins when you make your cider in oak, because oak has a lot of tannin in it. So if you're making in oak instead of steel or glass, you'll be adding some tannins into the mix. That sort of oakiness is also adding tannic acid into the mix. So that's the sensation. The actual molecules of the tannins, the longer molecules, the longer molecules in the acid, that's producing the astringency. The shorter sort of molecules create that bitterness in your mouth. So that's the difference between the two sensations. So far, so good. No one feeling rather nauseous, ready to stop, ready to go out to the light of day and survive this experiment. You do have 3 academics here. You do know that you are effectively a petri dish. You are part of the experiment.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So let's talk to whether cider styles. So the gentleman at the front was asking about the right proportion of different types of apples, and I was saying, hey, what you grow in your region is probably the right proportion. So there are apples, and they can be referred to as bitter sweets or bitter sharps, and there are traditions where those are heavily used around the world. So let's start with bitter sharps first. Very acidic, very tannic, maybe a fair amount of sugar. So in a region called Hesse in West Germany, in Frankfurt, which is the financial center for Germany, they use a fair amount of bitter sharps, but with astringency as part of bitter, and rather than bitter. And like the Spanish tradition, they're generally drinking it as a wine. It's in small glasses, right? Small sort of tumbler glasses. So that's an area well known for its bitter sharp tradition. There aren't that many bitter sharp traditions because there aren't that many bitter sharp fruits around the world. Of all those various varieties, if they have astringency or bitterness, they're more likely to be bitter sweets. And the tradition where that is most often used is in Western Europe, in the Western counties in the UK, in Normandy, in Brittany, where they prefer sort of drier, more tannic than Normandy, that tends to be sweeter ciders, but that's their tradition. That's where a lot of bitter sweets and bitter sharps are grown, and so they make it into the beverages that people are brewing 100% in any one of those categories, right? With the exception of bitter sharps, because some people will make what's referred to as a single variety. You've got acid, you've got tannins, you've got sugar for your ABV. So in some cases, people will make single varieties, usually from bitter sharps. But to the proportion question we heard earlier, for the Normandy, Brittany, the UK, where they use more bitter sweets. In the UK, it's usually about 50% bitter sweets, and then you make up the rest of the proportion with sweet and sharp apples. That's usually the case, particularly in the south, the very extreme southwest of England. In France, you're probably looking at a similar number. You're not looking at cider making traditions where they're sort of 80% sort of bittersweet or they're 80% bitter sharp. They tend to be around the sort of 40 to 60 range. You never see one cider making tradition with 100% all-in-one apples. There's a little bit of blending going on, unless you're looking to make that single variety cider. Don't make a single variety sweet cider, unless you love a chemistry test, because a single although you've got alcohol from the fermentation process, there isn't a lot of antimicrobial action otherwise, right? You don't have the acid sort of keeping down all the nasty things that can happen to cider. There are some really interesting nasty things that can happen to cider. 100% sweet juice is going to be pretty flat. You do not want to bottle age 100% sweet cider, not unless you want some sort of monster coming out of your cellar in 5 years, devouring you instead of you drinking it. And so it's a logarithmic scale. So 3 would be on the more acidic side for an apple fermentation, and it's 10 times as acidic as a 4. So generally you don't when you're brewing cider, if you've got a pH meter, you're generally looking for somewhere between 3.2 to 3.8. That's usually a pretty sort of safe spot to brew against. 3.2 is going to be pretty acidic. If you make it any more acidic like that, it's gonna those sort of malic, sort of appley sort of taste are gonna start tasting like lemon. It's gonna start tasting like citric acid. There are some apples that can be, lemon bombs because they have so much acid in them. But 3.2 to 3.8 is generally safe, a safe range. At 3.2, you don't need to use something called potassium metabisulfite in great quantities. It's A, because it sounds scary, which is not good. B, because it is the preservative E224, and none of us want to put any of the E's in anything that we consume, right? But generally, in the liquid, it becomes sulfur dioxide. It is an antioxidant preservative. It can clean the juice. If you've got something at the 4 scale or beyond 4, you're probably using SO2 immediately before you inoculate the yeast. If you're using a commercial yeast, you're also probably adding SO2 at bottling. And like I said, with the sweet ciders, they're going to be much lower than 4. So you've got to have a lot of intervention at that level. Yeah. 5.2 would 5.2 would have every single flaw that you could probably get in a. It's gonna smell and taste like the floor of a dairy farm. Again, it's a choice. There was the question to the early gentleman: what's the right proportion of apples? It's the choice in terms of what you like, what you prefer. So there are a lot of people who don't want to use SO2, so they tend to be on the lower end of the pH scale. They don't want to inoculate with yeast. They don't want to add anything else in. They want an entire wild fermentation, preferably with wild foraged apples. And some of the things you can do with that are amazing. But I use commercial yeasts for the most part. I like the chemistry, and I like the experimentation of isolating specific parts of the cider making process. But to all of us, it really depends on what we want the end product to be, what our preferences are. You don't want to use bread yeast. No, it's Saccharomyces yeast. You can use Brett. I've pitched Nottingham ale yeast, which produces some interesting flavors. It tastes like cider, but it smells like beer, which is somewhat of an off-putting experience, at least for me.
Experience at all, does it turn from apple cider to apple cider?
Okay. What point does it turn from apple cider to apple cider vinegar? It turns at that point where you do not do a good job keeping out oxygen and flies. So yeah, you decide, I don't need an airlock, I'm just going to keep it open to the world and see what happens. You'll very quickly have cider apple vinegar. Yes, nature will take care of that for you. But ultimately, if you're keeping it clean, you've got a good airlock. You're making sure that airlock is full, and you can avoid that process if you want to do so. There's a question in the back. How does yeast? So yeast converts the sugar. Many people think they live on sugar. They don't live on sugar. They're like us, right? We always like Ben and Jerry's on a Friday night, right? It's not our staple. It's not the thing we always eat. If it was, I'd have some trouble, fitting into the tent today. But they consume nitrogen in the must, in the liquid, but they also will consume sugar. So they live on the nitrogen. They will consume sugar like it's Friday night and it's not a school night. So and they convert that sugar over to alcohol and carbon dioxide. The bubbles you see coming up the bottom of the carboy, that's all the carbon dioxide they're letting off. answer your question. It's from Somerset County in England. So it's going to be very similar to some of the earlier apples you tasted. Certainly the apples with a fair amount of astringency and sugar. That's what you're going to taste. So again, this is from a cider tradition where bittersweets are very important. Generally, the 50% or more bittersweets in the mix. So this apple, you would either blend with, obviously with other quality sweet shop in the mix, but you're also likely to, depending on how many apples you have in this, you're likely to be blending it with some other bittersweets for your mix.
This would be like the
Cameron and his team are scientists. They're trying to isolate specific qualities, and that's why they're so down on the astringency, because it's not what they're actually looking to breed for. Cameron probably has a t-shirt that says some really nasty things with 4-letter words about astringency. But astringency comes down to personal taste, right? I like a red wine in the winter. I like that drying sensation, sitting in front of the fire, reading a book, you get that mild sort of drying sensation. You don't want to sort of be punched in the face with, a really strong sort of flavor profile. So that's astringency is pleasurable. People will enjoy it. We all sense and taste and like or dislike those tastes slightly differently. Some people are just going to love a little bit of astringency in a cider. It's very nice, but I think the challenge, and maybe Cameron can go into more of this. There are more astringent apples in the world than there are bitter apples, so it's easier to get billions more. So it's easier to get astringency in a brew than it is to get bitter. Interested in the history of cider apples. Heard that colonizers were particularly interested in the history of makers of cider. That's a difficult thing to address. And again, you've got an Australian and an English guy standing up here, so probably can't talk to either American history or American breeding for cider. It was just the reason why cider was so important. It was less because of the booze, although you could argue the Pilgrims arrived with a lot of booze and a lot of guns. They're ready for a party. But for survival, right? So one of the problems with just medieval society in general and life in general, certainly as the population started to grow around the world, not just here in North America, was survival. So what happens when you drink the water and that water, you're not sure of the source of that water? Well, you might get cholera. Cholera may be the least interesting and least damaging thing you get. So and this was true in England, even for children, that you would mix apple cider with water. Again, the alcohol would give it some sort of microbial resistance. It was healthier than the water you had to drink in most cases. So you'd be surprised at how many people drank cider. It was not just the common man's drink or common woman's drink, but it was that the entire family would drink it, and in many cases they would do so because the water options were debatable, and the health of the water options were debatable. When did that happen? And what sort of trends can we see as far as that behaviour? The first paper I read specific to cider on yeasts was actually from a gentleman called I think it's Frank Lloyd. So he was a cheesemaker, and he was contracted by a local landowner in Somerset in the 1890s to do essentially an audit of the cider making process, and this was at a time where people are realizing, the line between good apple cider and apple cider vinegar at the time was a very small line. It was, do I drink it? Do I feed it to the pigs? Do I clean my drains with it? You had some hard choices to make. So even then they were isolating yeasts, and we always, and it's hard for an Englishman to say this, but we always learn from the French. This is an omission here. Please do not record this session. But we learned from the French. The French have been isolating yeast for winemaking for about a century at that point, and started the academic process around the isolation of yeasts had been happened during that Victorian period, and so they adopted them. But it's only in recent years that commercial cider yeasts have become available. We've had to get on the beer bandwagon or the wine bandwagon. But it's very interesting to me that we're now isolating yeasts that we think are suitable for cider. But again, it comes down to personal choice. Do you want a wild fermentation? Do you want something that tastes more like wine? Do you want something that tastes more like beer or like bread? If that's your personal taste, then there is a yeast for you for that purpose. The cider percentage, part of it is the raw ingredients, right, which we're talking about today. So if you have less of those sweet apples, then your ABV is going to be a lower end. Typically, cider apple ABV can get between 6 to 8%. A white wine is in the 15% range. So it is a good degree lower than wine. So you use less sweet apples. You use less bitter sweets. You probably use more sharps and bitter sharps. So that's on the inputs. On the process, there is a way to slow the fermentation process. There are a couple of advanced techniques, one of them French. I won't talk to keeving, but you can look up keeving, and that's to remove those nitrogen compounds and to take away that main foodstuff for the yeast. So that will produce a very sweet cider, and again the French have particularly in Normandy have specialized in that. The other is something called racking, and you're doing something similar, but you're taking the yeast out of the mix with racking, and racking is simply avoiding the schmutz at the bottom of the fermenter. You basically try and take everything else. You're removing some of the nitrogen, you're removing some of the yeast, and you're slowing down the fermentation process. And if you do that enough times, you can stop the fermentation process dead. But typically, that would be the way that you would have more residual sugars left in your cider, less alcohol, because not all of that sugar is getting converted.